this on demand, you can actually watch this on demand or just listen to it with the podcast versions, which you can get on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, Google Play, Audio Boom, and iHeartRadio. Anywhere where you can download podcasts, you can download the Pat Mayo Experience. And this will be up there later on for you to consume whenever you'd like. We got an early start coming in tomorrow morning. We start at 6:45 a.m. Eastern Time. We're off the West Coast. We're back up by the point now when by the time you wake up, the guys are going to be on the course. So do not forget to set your lineups before you go to bed because you might not get a chance to wake up early. God knows I can't get up at 6 a.m. That's ludicrous. But we'll try to get to the first of your questions right now. Reid, is there actually anything you want to say before we get started here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. Now we kind of get a full field with all the international and the European players coming over, making their U.S. debut. We've seen some, right? We've seen a guy like Alex Noren do really well, committing to the PGA and not just necessarily playing and picking and choosing what tournaments he likes or what tournaments international guys like on the U.S. circuit on the PGA. So it's going to be nice. It's going to be a good test to see if the U.S. guys, see at the top that garner those top salaries, are going to have a return. So, I'm excited to see a quote-unquote fuller field than what we've seen so far.
All right, so the first question coming up, this comes from Dan Geiger from the Facebook chat. He asks, Ollie had a very poor showing last week. Do you expect him to rebound this week? And I think this is kind of odd because I was all over Ollie last week. But the big thing for me is tee to green, he's still been very good recently. And now we're going back to Bermuda. Plus, we might get a lot of wind. It's not going to be like outrageous wind. I mean, I use windfinder.com. I try to find the closest wind tower possible to the course, which I can bring it up this week and let everyone know which one that is because I have it on the hot links here so I can figure that out. But it didn't seem like it was anything more than 20 miles per hour. Now 17, 15, 17, 18 is, I wouldn't say significantly windy, but pretty windy as it goes. And Ollie's low ball flight can really help in a lot of those situations. So that's where I'm at with Ollie. I'll be overweight on him for DraftKings. Obviously, Feinberg and I both picked him on the show on Monday. So Reid, what do you think about Ollie?
Yeah, you know what's interesting? If you go on fantasynational.com and you do his last 12, he stacks out really nicely, kind of in that top 10, top 15 range. And like you said, he hits that ball, he drives it low. He doesn't necessarily, or you don't necessarily need to, right, hit it long here. You need to keep it in the short stuff. But when you go a little bit further, that last 24, he falls a little bit. But he does stat out nicely, right? Ball striking, what we've said, what you said in the past in this tournament. Strokes gained ball striking is extremely important here. So a guy like Ollie Schneider-Jans, if he's a lot of guys might look at that waste management, might look at his past tournaments this season and see that he's performed well. So a guy like Ollie Schneider-Jans will garner a lot at that price. Just make sure that if you are choosing him right at that price, that you're choosing him at that lower percentage ownership.
All right, so yeah, I'm in on Ollie. What do you make of the other guys around his range, though? Because there's a lot of people that I like in that $8,000 area. So for me, like Duffner seems like even a viable cash play. Kisner, I was a bit higher on earlier in the week. I backed off a little bit, especially from an overall pick standpoint when you throw salary out and you look at guys that are around the similar skill sets in terms of odds. I like Kazire almost a little bit better than that. Webb Simpson, I think, is coming in highly underrated. Berger had the very poor week at the Genesis, but I think that a lot more people are going to be able to forgive him for what he had done because of past course history. We know he's local to Florida, putts really well on Bermuda. Right. He is expensive, though. I think if it was me and I was looking around that range, the Ollie range, I'd go up to Duffner if I was going to move off a little bit, or at least distribute a lot of what I was up to onto Webb Simpson, and I would skip over Tiger Woods, Scott Stallings, a little bit of Rafa, then I'd go right down to Keimer. What are your other favorite plays in this $8,000 area?
Yeah, I like it. If you're going cash, right, Ollie Schneider-Jans is someone that it might be it might fade a little bit. A guy like Kisner, and even a guy like Berger, guys who haven't played well in the past, this idea that, if they miss the cut, we don't see them play, they might be faded a little bit. But a guy like Berger, and if you've seen the past results, whether it be runner-ups or championships here, they have been Florida residents, rightfully so. Right? A lot of guys, even the international guys coming over, call Florida home, or this is where when they're stateside, this is where they stay. So a lot of these Florida guys, a guy like Oosthuizen, right? We talk about it all the time. This guy travels with his own mattress on tour. So now he can sleep in his own bed. That's going to play a factor. So if I were going to play in that 8K range, Berger is someone that I'm looking in on just because of his past. I mean, his past performance was atrocious. The short game was terrible. He wasn't keeping in the fairway. So a guy like Berger, I'm going to be a little bit bullish on. If I had to go down in that Schneider-Jans range, Kisner is someone as well who didn't play well this past week or the season so far. So a guy like Kisner is someone I'm also looking at too, because at a par 70, this guy doesn't need to hit it far, right? Kisner is a grinder. I mean, we saw that last year with his play. So if I'm at that low range, right, that low 8K range, Kisner is someone that I'm going to be bullish on as well.
All right, here's a question from the Facebook feed. It's from Stephen Heyerbar. Get a better spelling on your last name, pal. He asks, so Nah has really great odds, but haven't heard much chatter on him. Am I missing something? Well, he's not in the field, so that's an easy fade for me. I mean, you want to take him, you go nuts. Play me in a few head-to-heads. We'll be good to go on that. Jump over to the Facebook page, see, who's Anderkirst this week? That's Chesson Hadley. And Reid, you were talking about how you like Chesson Hadley, but you can't quite pull the trigger. Is that enough to get you off of him now?
Definitely. That is scientifically proven. If Chesson has the Anderkirst, then I'm totally off of him.
All right, so let's see what else. Free time. Ryan Palmer, top 10. That's very interesting. I don't love the top 10 overall option. I prefer him more at his DK price. In that lower $7,000 area, I think it's really hard to find a lot of value. I mean, Sam Saunders is up there for me. I've taken a few shots personally on Johnny on Ben Martin. I got a lineup with Billy Horschel in it, but I do have that Scott Piercy, Ryan Palmer range just a little bit. We've seen the course history over the years with Ryan Palmer at PGA National. I know he loves to find the water, and there's plenty of water for him to find here, but he is gaining strokes off the tee almost every single week, and this is a track where he's plenty familiar with. Ryan Palmer plays his best golf the first 4 months of the year before he burns out every single season, and last year he was going through injury, and now he's back to sort of the Ryan Palmer that we know. So do you like Ryan Palmer down there in the low $77,000 area?
Yeah, he's a course horse where he plays really well at this course. And the thing about Palmer, if he starts off nicely on Thursday and Friday, this guy can really come into the weekend. But in terms of that 7K range, even a guy like Luke Donald. Luke Donald is a guy who always plays well here. This guy has admitted he's given up a couple of strokes to the field off the tee. He's already sort of coming into that knowing that he's got to gain strokes somewhere else. So his iron play, his wedge, his putting, that's where when he was number one in the world, that's what he didn't miss any putts. So a guy like Luke Donald at that 7K range,
hold on a second here. Luke Donald reeks. He gained almost seven strokes putting last week at Riviera and couldn't even manage to sneak inside the top 35. So let's say he just putts like a good human, not an out of this world human. Yeah, he's not going to do anything.
Yeah, I mean it's the Finau effect, right? These guys who can't putt, who stat out nicely in some other areas. But I mean, if you're going to choose Luke Donald, if you want to take that 7K range, right? If you want to go heavy at the top and you need some price relief, some salary relief, like there's a guy like Luke Donald, you can take a shot on him, right? If he's gaining 7 strokes putting, right? You can say, well, if that cuts in half, what's he really doing, right? That's, I'm looking at course history, especially, and then corollaries, right? Par 70s. There's a few out there, like TPC at Potomac, Wildlife, Sony Open. And a guy who does well, a guy who's performed well at those, Colonial is another one, is Luke Donald. So if I'm at that range, I'll have a little exposure to Luke.
All right, so the guys that I would prefer over Luke Donald down in this area, and someone else just asked on the Facebook thread, who are some lower-owned GPP-type flyers? I guess for you, it is Luke Donald. For me, I mean, Sam Saunders is going to be kind of chalky at $7,100. I'm okay eating that chalk. I think that he's just been so good that you can go with it. Bronson Burgoon, I prefer over Luke Donald. Even in terms of ball striking, he's just been a lot better, and his long irons are far superior to Luke Donald right now. And even dropping down a little bit, Tom Hoagie's down there. I love me some Hollywood Hoagie. I worry that he's been relying on his putter too much recently, and that although the ball striking rates out well, that's from a few tournaments ago. But when I talked about the corollary courses, Sony and Colonial, that, hey, he should have won the Sony Open and then didn't, fading down the stretch. But hey, if I can get a top 5 finish out of Tom Hoagie at $7,000, hell, if I can get a top 25 at a Tom Hoagie at $7,000, I'm going to be fine with that. And I guess the other guys down there, I'm going back to JJ Spawn. He lost 11 combined strokes putting and chipping last week. That is an aberration. That almost... and that was over 2 rounds, too. Just think about how many strokes that is. Ball striking-wise, although he did lose with approaches last week, I still like where he's at off the tee with his irons. I like how this course sets up for him, and I think that he can rectify it a little bit. He's going to come in at like 1% owned or less because he's coming off that injury in Phoenix. And a lot of people just don't want to go back to him, especially since he was double digits over par last week. But these are the type of guys that you can go back to. There's a lot of recency bias baked in. I mean, we all love J.J. Spawn. Hell, 5 weeks ago, he was one of the chalkier players. Now he's not on anyone's radar. You don't need a lot of exposure to J.J. Spawn. Let's say you play 20 lineups, you can use him in 2. You can use him in 1 if you want. Hell, if you use him in 1, you're 5 times the field. Use him in 2, if he wins, you're probably going to win all the money. So J.J. Spawn is someone else that I like down there. What are you looking at for low-owned GPP flyers if you're playing Stars and Scrubs rosters?
Yeah, I mean, J.J. Spawn is a guy that, right, he's good, like you said, garner low ownership. I mean, he's at that price, too. What are you expecting, right? A top 15, I mean, a top 20 at 6,900. You know, if you get a top 15, he's statting out, like we talked about earlier in the show. Strokes gained, ball striking, he's, I think, top 10 of the last 24. So a guy like J.J. Spawn at 6,900, you know, is something that I really like. Another guy down there, Sean O'Hare. I mean, this guy has made cuts. He's consistent. So if you want to get to the weekend, right, again, what are you looking at this price? What are you looking for return at 68 or that high 6 to low 7? If a Sean O'Hare can get you to the weekend and then give you nice return, a guy, again, doesn't need to hit the ball far, but keep it in the fairway. The proximity from that 150, that 175, a guy like Sean O'Hare at that price, and you're not gonna roster 3 or 4 of these guys down here. So if it's one or a couple at max, those would be my 2 guys.
I will mention, and I'm kind of on board with you in terms of safety, I wouldn't want to dip this low in terms of cash games. But, I mean, if you're very confident that these guys are going to make the cut, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I will say for tournament play, Stewart Cink and Sean O'Hare are both setting up to be the $6,000 chalk. Everything is gravitating towards that. And when I talk about $6,000 chalk, I'm not talking about 25% owned. Like, these guys might, you know, be in the 7 to 12% own range, depending on how it all shakes out and the size of the tournament that you're playing in. So when it comes to me, someone like Stewart Cink for tournaments at least, if I'm not going to eat that in cash, that's still too low for me to go. I think I can build a more balanced roster that is much better. But if I'm looking at Stewart Cink at like 10% owned, and I can just look around, hey, Morgan Hoffman came second here last year. Not that I love Morgan Hoffman, but if he's going to be 1% and Stewart Cink is going to be 10% owned, I would rather just play Morgan Hoffman knowing that he's going to beat him more than 1 time out of 10.
Right, exactly, right. You're not living down here in the high 6 range. There is a lot of value, right? There's a lot of value in those mid salary ranges, in the high 7s, low 8s. So I'm looking at building, if you're in terms of roster strategy as well, I'm looking at not necessarily having a lot of exposure at the top, which is interesting because if you look at a guy like Ricky, who stat-wise, or a guy like Justin Thomas, from a stat perspective, they rate out really well here. But I think the market, or what you're looking at here, is a guy like Ricky going to garner a lot of exposure? I think a guy like, you know, Justin Thomas, who sets up well, who lives right again in Jupiter with Ricky Fowler and all these guys, it's a nice concept, but at that price, I think it's a little too expensive for me.
Jay-Z asks, and I don't think it is that Jay-Z, because he probably doesn't need, he could probably afford to pay his own DFS expert to work for him. So, you know, it's probably not the same Jay-Z, but we'll see. He asks, in cash games, where would you go that's not named Fleetwood, Garcia, or Woodland? I do agree that Garcia is probably your best building block for all cash games this week at the high end in terms of pure safety. But where else do you look at in terms of cash? For me, in cash games, I like Jason Duffner in that mid $8,000 area, and I have no problems playing Sam Saunders at $7,100. I think the way that he's playing, the way that he putts on Bermuda, the way that he sets up at this course in the past, I think that he's very safe.
Yeah, I mean, at that 8K range, right, you have to sort of qualify this question and quantify it. At what range are you looking at, right? It's not just one player that's going to pop. But in that 8K range, I mean, Harman, and it remains to be seen, right? The jury is still out that he just, you know, took the West Coast swing out. He didn't really play. He was playing really well before that. Just didn't want to play Pebble Beach and some of these other courses like Riviera. But a guy like Harman at that higher price, again, we kind of talk about it in football too, right? If guys come off buys or injuries, sometimes these guys go unowned or don't have a lot of exposure. So at that range, if you're a little off on Berger, you know, Harman is someone. If I go down to the 7K range, Thomas Pieters is another guy that coming over from Europe.
Would you really use Thomas Pieters in cash games here?
I mean, again, if I'm looking at something, yeah, I would. I mean, I would have some exposure on Thomas Pieters just because in terms of the stats, what he's doing on the Euro Tour, which, again, is not the same, right? Winning on that, doing and performing well on the Euro side is not the same. But I would have a little exposure on Thomas Pieters just because he sets up nicely for this course. Again, keeping it in the short stuff. A guy like Thomas Pieters is someone that does that.
I would stay so far away from Thomas Pieters in cash games. Like, there's just no safety. I mean, we saw it last year when everyone piled onto him, and he was the chalk here, and all he could do was hit the ball in the water. So, I mean, listen, I like Adam Scott this week in terms of tournament upside, but I would not use him in cash games. His game is just not rounded into that type of form. Like, Chesson Hadley for cash games makes way more sense. Now, I have fears about Chesson Hadley. I think that, where he's Andrew Curse, that's never a great thing. But if you're just looking for someone to make the cut, and that's what you're looking for in cash games, that's the move.
True. Another guy there is Keegan Bradley, right? Again, if you take putting out of it, Keegan Bradley is another guy. If you want to go to the weekend, he's been there. So, again, I'm looking at in terms of ball striking, in terms of a safe play. Yes, Thomas Pieters, in terms of recency bias, hasn't done well. But at the same time, right, if you might have talked me up a little bit with Pieters' exposure, but at that 7K range, those are some of the guys that I like.
Listen, Thomas Pieters for tournaments, I get it. For cash games, no thanks for me. Next question from Harley Boyd. We had to talk about Tiger. Is Tiger Woods going to make the cut? Now, the Vegas odds currently have him as an even. Even money on both sides. You can bet him to make the cut, it's even money. To miss the cut, it's even money. I actually think that he makes the cut here this week, only because when I watched him at Riviera, the big thing that really stuck out to me was how poorly he was hitting his driver. Now, the good thing about PGA National, even though it is incredibly hard, is he's not going to have to, if he sticks to driver, he's going to be in a world of trouble. But if he clubs down and hits those stingers like we've seen him do in the past, he can keep the ball on the fairway. If he stays on the fairway, the irons, putting, and short game have been capable enough that he should be able to make the cut here. So I'd be in on Tiger to make the cut. That said, I'm not betting him. I'm not putting him on my DraftKings team whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, if you're missing the ball, right, these guys always talk about playing their misses, and they're so good that they know where they're going to miss it. Tiger had no idea where he was missing it. He was missing it on both sides of the fairway. What he wasn't keeping. The only thing that was salvaging Tiger was the short game. Now, that's not necessarily one of the key stats that I'm honing in on here. But if he's clubbing down, it'll be interesting, right? Because this is, again, not having a swing coach. Is he too prideful to club down? All of these factors, if you just look at the stats, it doesn't stat out well. But if he's able to club down and just hit 3-wood, which is easy, right, at this course, because it's not long, it's only a little over 7,100 yards, I think he has a good chance. But he's got to keep it in the fairway, because if you don't, like you said, I mean, holes 5 through 7 play extremely hard. The bear trap, there's so much water, and there's so much penalty areas that Tiger can incur, and if you're not keeping it straight, then there's no chance.
Okay, next question comes from Ross Watson. He actually has two questions, and one of these names is super intriguing to me. The first one is asking about two Brits. What are your thoughts on Tyrrell Hatton this week? I actually like Hatton. I know he was dealing with the wrist injury. He appears to be fine. It was just like Louis. Louis was dealing with an injury. He, too, appears to be fine as well. I actually like Hatton. I prefer Fleetwood. I prefer Noren as outright winners more, but when you compare everything to the DraftKings pricing, if I'm going to talk about the 3 euros that are up in that spot, I like Fleetwood the best, I like Hatton second, and then I like Noren. That would be the way that I would go with it in terms of value of DraftKings pricing. Yeah,
I mean, for me, that top play is Hatton. I think, again, right there on that statistic, ball striking is the key set that I'm really looking at. And then, strokes gained par 4 at that 450 to 500. Look, he's standing out nicely on the Euro side as well. Not the same, right? A guy like Paul Casey, who's always stats out nicely, has so many wins in the Euro Tour, but he can't win the PGA. So I don't hone in too much on the Euro Tour stats, but a guy like Hatton, who hasn't missed a cut yet, who stats out nicely at ball striking, will be my top. And then I would go, I just think Fleetwood's going to be highly owned. I think that price for Fleetwood, he's going to be another chalk play. So I would probably go Noren above Fleetwood, although again, right, he stats out extremely nicely. Again, it's strategy, right? If you're going GPP, I would be a little bit less inclined to go with Fleetwood, but I would just go Hatton. My top three in that would be Hatton, Noren, and then Fleetwood. Well, see, I'm going to stick with Fleetwood. He's my pick to win this. He's my one-and-done pick of the week. I like where he's at, so there's no amount of chalk that can get me off of Tommy Fleetwood. And I think that's something that people get themselves into a conundrum with when it comes to large-scale GPPs a lot of the time, is that, hey, this guy's going to be, I like him, but he's going to be chalky. Just use him. If there's a player that you like, it doesn't matter how owned he's going to be. If you think that player is going to win or come inside the top 5, that isn't one of the, now if you're like, hey, Ricky's going to come T7 this week,
that probably means don't use Ricky kind of thing, where he's the most expensive player. But if we're dealing with someone who's inside the top 10 and in the $9,000 range, and you think that guy has a chance to win, take him. I don't care if he's 30% owned, which he won't be. He'll be like 17% owned, which isn't all that chalky. The one good thing about this week is that it looks like ownership is going to be distributed pretty evenly across the board because there are so many intriguing options and so much value to be mined out of certain areas. So the other question that Ross had was, what about Ian Poulter? You mentioned Luke Donald earlier. I much prefer Ian Poulter.
Yeah, he's another one that we don't really get to see. Maybe this is a Ryder Cup year, right? Ryder Cup year, this guy always plays nicely. But I don't know. I mean, Poulter strikes me as a guy, too, that likes this is going to sound really rudimentary, but he likes to play golf, right? He's a guy that likes the lifestyle. And I think a guy like Poulter, who, if I'm looking at stats, right, I'm looking at, again, strategy and all these things, I'd rather have a guy who's coming in, who has good course history, who sets up a little bit better in terms of his style of play. I mean, Poulter popped a couple of times at a couple of tournaments last year, but he doesn't strike me as a guy, on this course that that would do well. So, I'm going to be off on Poulter. I'm going to be a little bit more on Donald, which I know is not a popular thing to say on the Pat Mayo experience.
Well, I mean, listen, they're both going to be sub 2% owned. I personally did not use any Poulter, but I understand the case for him a little bit better. When you're dealing with Luke Donald, you're really hoping that his short game and his putting is off the charts because the guy can't drive or hit irons. When you're talking about Ian Poulter, at least in the course of the last year, you're talking about a guy that's been a supreme ball striker, a guy that's had success at Colonial, a crossover course in the past, a guy who's had success at this course in the past. He dunked one on 17 to miss the playoff with Patty and Berger 2 years ago, but he was right in that mix. And you talk about this being a Ryder Cup year. If I had to choose between the both of them, and I've chose to take neither of them, but Poulter would easily be the runaway winner in that one.
Yeah. I mean, again, he's an emotional guy too. He's an emotional player. So if he can get his momentum up to where he was playing, when he made that comment, I don't know what it was, a decade ago, is that just him and Tiger at the top. This guy has the moxie to do well, right? He came out of nowhere last year and played well in some of the majors. So I can see where that question is coming from and see, like, if I'm trying to find value at that low salary, that low cost range, I can see that. But I'm going to go on Donald.
All right, Austin asks, what's your approach when doing single entries? Now, this week is a bit tougher for me because the one thing that I really like to do when I play single entries is really try to identify the high-end chalk. So, for example, let's use the Genesis as something to look at from last week. Dustin Johnson and Rory McIlroy were sitting right there. And Dustin Johnson, especially in single entries, went off at around 5 to 6 times the ownership of Rory McIlroy. So, I just faded the very top-end chalky guy and moved down. Now, that turned out to be the wrong choice. Dustin Johnson, actually just not taking either of them would have been the better choice, and moving on to someone like Justin Thomas, who is a lot cheaper, or even Phil or Bubba or anything like that. But of the very high-end options, I think that's a very easy way to differentiate your teams, is by identifying the high-end chalk. And this week it looks like it's going to be Ricky. And Ricky and Sergio will probably be the two of the highest-owned guys at the very top end, and then pivoting on to someone else. So let's say Justin Thomas this week, or even Rory again, who expects to be the lowest-owned of that entire crowd. The way that you need to approach it is, hey, if this one guy, let's say Ricky is an example this week, let's say he goes off at 25% ownership, 30% ownership for the sake of this discussion of single entry. You don't take Ricky Fowler, he's 30% owned. You take Rory, who's going to be like 5 to 10% in single entries. Now, how many times out of 10 is Rory going to beat Ricky? I mean, right now, with the way that Rory's playing, 4 out of 10 times based on actual skill level, probably 6 out of 10 times. And that's the way that you can really differentiate your teams in single entry. That way, if you take the high price guy that is the lower ownership, you can go pretty chalky with the rest of your team because that combination doesn't really exist. So you can play almost a cash style roster with your big risk coming from fading the really chalky high end guy at the top. Would you add anything to that?
That's exactly what I would do as well. I mean, that's exactly what you do. You pivot off, right? If you're only doing single entry, what is your objective, right? This is sort of your one lottery ticket as opposed to putting in 20. So if you identify those guys, right, Fantasy National does a great thing now where they have those projected ownerships. You can go there if you're a member. At the same time, right, now you're looking at, if I'm off on Ricky, or even in that top tier, right, what are you looking for? What's the return? If a guy like Rory, right, at that price, you're looking for, right, a top 5 or a victory, so like you were saying, you could play that at those lower salary ranges, but there's so much value. I'm treating this tournament a little bit like a major in the sense of we have a lot of talent at that lower K range that we haven't had a lot of exposure, or there isn't a lot out there currently on how these guys are performing, unless you're doing your research, unless you're building your own custom stat model. So I think that's a great strategy for the single entry.
Brian Marshall asked, how much is wind going to be a factor this week? And I finally got around to pulling up the pages. So again, windfinder.com is the site that I use. It has little airport towers, gun ranges, that kind of thing. But it's actually been almost the best one to use over and over and over. It's like what fly fishermen use to make sure, and hunters use to make sure what the wind is going to be that day. So the one that I use is called Old Port Cove Marina / North Palm Beach. That's the one that I found was the closest proximity to the golf course at PGA National. In fact, I will put that into the chat right now if anyone wants to go check that out. So boom, that's in the Facebook chat. Couldn't put it in the YouTube chat. Don't have the access to that one right now as I'm talking live. But even just to go through it a little bit, Thursday, we said they tee off around 6:45. It's going to be consistent 14, 15, 14, 13, 12 for the course of Thursday. So no significant advantage there. Even the peaks don't get any higher than 17. So there's not going to be a lot of fluctuations. Now, that's just what the weather tracker is telling us. All of a sudden it could just gust up to 30, but we can't predict that. That's going to show up at random, or if it shows up at all, we don't know. So that's really hard to plan for. On Friday, it looks like it's going to be a consistent 16 with gusts up to 20 throughout the course of the morning, and then as it goes on, you're going to get a dip down to 14 and 13. So theoretically, if this keeps up, that the PM or the AM-PM stack would have a slight advantage, but nothing that I would go out of my way to be like, oh, I'm making 80% of my lineups with the AM-PM stack and avoiding the PM-AM. I have a couple of lineups that are built that way anyway, all PM, all AM, but that's usually what I do on a week-to-week basis, just to put yourself into the position to capitalize should there be some sort of unforeseen weather that we don't see. But in all, I don't really see rain or wind being much of a devastating factor this week. It's going to be an influence, definitely, because those are not light winds by any means. 15 miles per hour isn't gusty, but it's still blowing out there, and it'll make the bear trap incredibly difficult, but it's going to be consistent for everyone across the terms of the week, at least from what I can see right now.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like, I keep on going back to football, right? And a guy like, I know you talked to me on your podcast earlier, is a guy like Brad Evans, used to be a meteorologist. It's those high gusts, right? It's those high winds that really affect it. Now, golf's a little different in football, right? Obviously, there's different factors at play there. Stating the obvious, the ball sizes are different. So there's a little difference in that. But where it's really going to affect, right, is the guys who can't keep it in the fairway. Usually, right, wind and rain, when you get that thick Bermuda in the rough, when you get those swirling winds at PGA National, that's when it really affects, right? So again, guys that we think that are going to be good at ball striking, keeping it in the fairway, these are the guys that, right, the 15 to 20, it's not going to be much, right? And it's not going to affect. These guys are too good to let, someone like me, I might be affected because I might get in my own head and then I'll dribble one, 10 yards up the fairway or in the rough. So guys like the pros, they're not going to worry about a 15 to 20 too much.
Kyle asks, what about Johnny Vegas? Why isn't anyone talking about him? Decent history and puts his best on Bermuda. I'm looking at Fantasy National right now, and yes, he does put his best on Bermuda because he doesn't massively lose strokes on Bermuda like he does on every other putting surface. He still is in the negative, though. It's not like Bermuda just makes him a good putter, but we always kind of talk about this type of player. Hey, if you can get an average putting week out of them, then boom, these sort of elite ball strikers are going to hit. The reason no one's going to talk about him because he was the chalk at Torrey Pines and missed the cut, and then last week people are like, oh, he's a hot sleeper. And then he missed the cut. Although even last week, he did lose a bunch of strokes putting, which could normalize itself very easily in 4 trips since 2012 at the Honda Classic. Last year, he was 4th and 2nd in DraftKings points as well. Missed the cut the year before that, 12th and 67th. I think he's an interesting flyer. He's not someone that I went with because we see Johnny Vegas hit these stretches of really poor play and extended missed cuts. However, he is a player that we've seen in the past that could miss 8 cuts in a row and then boom, win a tournament. So what do you make of Johnny Vegas?
Yeah, he doesn't stat out well in my model as well. I mean, I'm looking to, outside of ball striking, his strokes gained par 4 at that 450 to 500. And if you look at the top 10 finishers from last year, these guys really gained quite a few strokes in that area. So a guy like Johnny Vegas, and he's more of a guy, and the reason why, one thing to just go back a little bit, the reason why no one's talking about him is that all the things that we're about to say or that was said, right? He just doesn't stat out nicely he's chalk and he does well on the West Coast swing. And so now when we don't get that result that was projected, obviously there's going to be a reason why we're not on him or that he's not going to do well, right? So you could talk yourself into, hey, look, no one's going to play him, hasn't done well, and he's just going to hit. All of that stuff being said, yeah, a guy like Johnny Vegas is an elite ball striker. When he's a guy that's sneaky long as well. So even on these long courses that Vegas plays, he can play well. But for me, he doesn't stat out well at that par 4 at that range or necessarily ball striking in the past 24. So I'm not going to be on Vegas.
Okay, so we got 2 questions here about the same guy, Tom M. and Vince. Shout out to you, Vince, for always watching. They both asked, what do you make of Kazire? Does it scare you that he's playing with Tiger? Because he could come off as kind of chalky here. I think he's massively undervalued this week, and I'll eat the chalk. But I'm not going to pretend like playing with Tiger, he's the only 2-time winner on tour so far this year, but playing with Tiger could get a little bit dicey since he's never done it before. But now we're trying to project into a mental aspect type of things, and that's just really hard to do. It's the reason that I didn't pick Bubba last week, because I thought, oh, he's only going to care about the Celebrity All-Star game, and then he wins, and I didn't play him, and I'm an idiot. So I don't want to make that mistake with Kazire.
Right, and even guys like Rory and Justin Thomas, who are weathered, who are the stars on the PGA, mentioned last week, hey, it's a whole other animal. Right? I can imagine what Phil and Ernie and some of these guys, when they were playing with Tiger in his heyday, how much that was increased, right? So if those guys are saying it, there's going to be some effect. But hey, if Kazire, right, he has the game, right? He's won early in the season. That's what we just talked about earlier in the show. There's some corollaries that he's done really well at. So stat-wise, it's great, right? But the Tiger, influence and the crowds and everything, you don't want to necessarily play with that. And then it's hard to project, right? We're not there, we don't know, so it's hard to project what a guy like Kazire, who we don't have a lot of exposure on right now in these pressure situations, is going to perform. So, has the game. We'll see if he can play well with Tiger. Then he'll be a guy that we'll have to watch out this year.
Are you going to be in or out on Kazire? I'm in.
I'm out.
Okay.
I'm out. I'm out.
All right. So next guy I wanted to talk about, because someone just asked this in the YouTube chat, which continue to leave your questions. We're going to be here a while. Come hang with us. Like, we got golf to talk about. We can talk about this for hours. Aaron Wise, what do you make of him this week? And it's funny because when I think of Aaron Wise, I think of a guy who's really good off the tee and then struggles in other areas. But when you go back and look at it, of his past results so far this season, he didn't play well at Sony, which is a shorter course. But if you go and look at the short tracks versus long tracks that he's played, missed the cut at the Genesis, 15th, the Pebble Beach, which is a shorter track. Farmers, a daunting track, missed the cut. Career Builder, short track, Wedge Fest, 17th. So he's in a really interesting situation. I can tell you, the FantasyNational.com simulator has him way higher than I would have ever expected. He's sort of like the Austin Cook of the week, where you're like, the hell is that guy doing up there? Why is his win equity so much higher to his both DraftKings price and overall betting odds? It's still not enough for me to go in, though. I'm going to take a pass on Aaron Wise.
Yeah, again, you can talk yourself into, right? You can say, look, he does well at these corollaries, and you have to take it with a grain of salt as well, right? If Fantasy National, or just the research that you're doing on a guy like Aaron Wise, who comes in that 40 range, in terms of ranking in my stat sheet, is not someone that I'm going to be keen on. And even if you look at that 7K range that he's in, there's guys that I necessarily won't be keen on either. So I look at it this way too, if there's a salary range that I don't necessarily like, I'm not necessarily going to go in on someone and say, okay, at that low 7, I'm going to pick this guy because of X, Y, and Z, right? He has to make sense to you from a stat model standpoint, from a passing the eye test, and then also someone that is performing well. So I'm not going to be unwise either.
NDW asked, do you guys look at tournament matchup odds between players to help you decide in your DK lineups? For example, this week, Rory McIlroy is a -150 favorite against Justin Thomas. And if so, what do you look for them? I don't do a lot of that. What I like to do is I go on Fantasy National, and there's a head-to-head simulator. So I like to look at what the actual odds are between these guys over different date ranges or at specific courses and how they compare to each other. I think that is a very valuable tool, and I think that one thing that can indicate, weirdly enough, is going to be sort of a chalk range, because Justin Thomas is going to be higher owned than Rory this week, despite the fact that the Vegas odds are telling you that Rory's a big favorite to win. The problem with betting odds and comparing them to DraftKings prices, I think they work better when you look at the lower tier, whether it's outright odds or you get a certain head-to-head matchup that aren't between the big names, because so much of the odds and what Vegas puts out is trying to get you to bet on that number. I mean, Tiger Woods is 60-1 this week. He should not be 60-1. He should be like 200-1, except people are betting Tiger at 60-1, so what's the need to make him any more? When you look at someone like Rory versus Justin Thomas, sharp people will probably, say, hey, plus 115, I can get more than my return back betting Justin Thomas at something that sounds pretty equal. I'll do that. And I think a lot of sharp people will when it comes to this week. But when you have your casual bettor who bets a golf matchup, they see, oh, Rory? I'll take Rory. And that's honestly what people think. It's why Phil Mickelson's 20 or 25-1 to win every tournament when he shouldn't be, because he never wins. But that's almost sort of the thing that goes behind it. There's so much name value and perception baked into odds. And sometimes that can translate over into the DraftKings pricing as well. But more or less, the DraftKings pricing does a better job in most weeks of reflecting how the actual value should set up. So do you look at these head-to-head matchups?
Only if I'm choosing between the two of them. If I can't, right, they're standing out nicely and everything, and I'm talking myself into a conundrum, right? Yeah, I might do the head-to-head, but you mentioned something, that name value, right? I mean, what's Tiger at Augusta? I mean, last time I checked, he was at ungodly, odds. Some of that shouldn't be. I think he's in that range of where Rory and some of these top guys are, because he has that name value. People want to bet, right? They want to bet the Cowboys, for instance, right? These name value teams who might not necessarily stat out, or they might not necessarily have value in that matchup or at this tournament. You really got to watch out, because Vegas is their position, right, is to break even and get the thing. They want you to play these on a more emotional side. So for me, I don't necessarily look at those outside of what you mentioned earlier, which is those lower price guys who are standing out nicely. If we're getting more return, that's where I'm really focusing on Vegas odds, as opposed to some of these top guys. Because again, I mean, like a guy like Tiger at Augusta should not be where he's at currently. So, and even here, right, he shouldn't be 60-1 here as well. There's just it's silly.
So one of the big ones this week, if you look at odds versus DraftKings pricing, the one that really sticks out from the $6,000 area is William McGirt. He's 100-1 to win the tournament, and he's being priced around guys that are 200 and 250-1. So that would make a lot of logical sense for me. I know I didn't do this a few weeks ago, and my producer Paul kind of pointed it out to me. Hey, Russell Henley's down in like the $6,000 area, and he's like 50-1 to win, and everyone else is $300 to win or 300-1 to win. I was like, nah, screw Russell Henley. And he ended up having a really good week because he's a much better player than all these other guys that are down there. So McGirt makes a lot of sense in terms of how his Vegas odds shape up compared to his DraftKings odds. I think that is a more valuable tool when you're comparing any sort of betting odds in terms of DraftKings price. Next one, pick one for GPPs. This again is from NDW. Howell, Kazire, McDowell, or Donald. Now, in terms of ownership, it's going to go Kazire, McDowell, Howell, and Donald. Although Howell can always creep up because he always does. Howell actually sets up really nicely for me here. It's just I just never want to pull the trigger on him, although the price is kind of nice. I would go Kazire, then McDowell, then Howell, then Donald, although I'm playing both Kazire and McDowell, and I have zero exposure to Donald or Howell.
Yeah, I mean, McDowell, he has course history here as well, right? So if I'm going GBP, it would be similar. A guy like Howell, he pops all the time. I mean, last year, this guy hardly missed a cut, right? Hardly missed a cut, so he was nice in the weekend. So if you're playing that GBP, if you can get 6 guys on the weekend, that's huge value. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, Howell always strikes me as a guy who plays extremely well or likes the West Coast swing and then kind of takes a lull and then comes back, and he's kind of just always around. So if I'm looking at that, Kazire would probably be second, then McDowell, and then Howell. And again, if I'm playing GPP, yeah, Donald, for me would be last. But he's still my sleeper.
All right, so I just want to go back and look at see what I believe Howell has played well at this event in the past. I think this is the one where it kind of comes off. He's made the cut 5 of the past 6 years, but no finishes better than T26, and that was 5 years ago. So we know him as a cut maker. The guy makes like 80% of his cuts. So if you wanted to use him in cash instead of Sam Saunders down in that range, I can get it. I would still prefer to use Sam Saunders though. I mean, even taking a look at the guys that are around him. I mean, do I trust McDowell more? I trust Kazire more for sure, and I trust McDowell more, and I like the form plus the course history. I like to see that Graham popped a little bit, especially tee to green, because the putting wasn't all the way there, and we know he's a better coastal player. We know he's a better Bermuda player, so I think that he is supremely undervalued this week.
Well, another guy. at that range. We talked about it earlier, Scott Piercy, right? Not a lot of good course history here, but pops off with those stats in terms of that low 7K range. So keep your eye on Scott Piercy as well. He's in the past 12, 24, and some of the other corollaries that I was running my stat model, and he kept on popping up. So I'm not going to have a lot of exposure with Piercy because I think you can find value elsewhere. But he's another guy that I like in that low 7K range. If you're trying to get value, right? If it's a safe play, right? If you want to just, stay even par, so to speak. Charles Howell is a guy, like we talked about. He makes cuts. So if you want to go there and be safe, Charles Howell, but Scott Piercy is another guy that was popping off my stat model as well.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Scott Piercy because I think you and I are both looking at the same thing. I punched in my custom stats and key stats into my fantasy national model, and boom, over the past 24 rounds, Scott Piercy is actually 6th. So over the past 24 rounds in this field, compared to the field, he's 8th in strokes gained approach, 13th in strokes gained ball striking, 25th in par 4 scoring overall, and 17th from 175 to 200-yard proximity gained on approaches. So it makes a lot of sense. And he is a very good wind player when it comes up to it. I just worry that we're being influenced by Scott Piercy on the West Coast, who typically just plays a lot better on the West Coast. You talk about Howell being a West Coast guy. Piercy's kind of that guy too. Yeah,
and that's one thing, right? You really got to, again, you can do analysis paralysis, say like he played well in the West and not so much in the Atlantic or the Florida swing. But at the same time, right, and that's, again, go back to the previous question, if it's those two guys, right, if you're looking at Howell and Piercy or some of these guys, use some other information like looking at the odds. Say if Piercy is coming in, at a return on investment that's 25% more at a Howell, then what am I not looking at, right? I'm looking at stats, I'm looking at current form and past history and so on and so forth. But a guy like Piercy, to me, is someone that I'm going to be a little keen on as opposed to not. And do away with him only preferring playing well or preferring the West Coast.
Another guy who's in that range that people have questions about, this is from Aaron Wellman. He asked about Benny Ann. I mean, Byung-Hun An, he's dynamite. I generally do like him a lot here, but the ball striking is always kind of key with him, and we've seen him win big tournaments overseas in the past. We've seen 9 of the past 13 winners of the Honda Classic, all international winners. I think that Benny Ann makes a good GPP flyer. He's not one that I'm using, but if you want to use him out there, I actually think that he makes a lot of sense at really low ownership, a guy that can fill it up when he's running right on par 4s over and over and over again, plus that ball striking would be off the charts. But I just look at his range, and I see Benny Ann at $7,400. I prefer to go up to Grillo at 75 or down at the same price to Luke List at 74. Luke List's game is turning back around. He never putts, so we're not going to bank on that. But the tee to green has been very, very good the past 2 weeks, and he has a good track record here at the Honda. I mean, he can keep it in the fairway because he's not inclined to use driver, but on the 2 par 5s, he can get there.
Yeah, or even in that range too. A Ryan Moore, right?
Ryan Moore can take his tie and go F himself. How about that?
Like the no sponsor, where he went for a year with no sponsor, it was just a blank hat. That was kind of weird. But again, what are you looking at this range, right? You're looking at value, and if you look again at the odds at some of those guys, I'm finding a little more value, a little higher up there with, like you were saying, like Grillo and some of the other guys at that range. So I can see where the argument is for Benny Ann, but for me, not this tournament.
All right, is Brian Harman, this guy says, Brian Harman is my favorite GPP play of the week. You've mentioned Harman a little bit earlier. I'm not sure what to make of him coming off having hit the wall a little bit earlier this season. The time off could have him refreshed. I mean, statistically, he lines up really well. This is more of a gut feeling type thing. However, I think that if you went up a little bit, if you want the GPP play of the week, and I mean, Harman and this guy could be absolute bust, but I can assure you, no one is owning Patrick Reed this week.
Yeah, no one is, right? I mean, Patrick Reed is another guy that his short game is so amazing that he just can't drive the ball. He can't stick with the guys that drive the ball. And even those short putts, those like 5 to 10 foot putts, whenever he gets down the stretch, he just can't seem to convert. But he's another guy that no one really is talking about. So again, GPP, low ownership, guys that aren't getting talked about, all these things factor into a guy like Patrick Reed. The only thing is, right, if he can't keep it in the fairway, which has sort of always been his Achilles heel, and not get saved, right? Look at what he did at Pebble Beach. I mean, it was just atrocious. So if he can't keep it in the fairway, then that's going to be a bust, obviously. But he's a guy that does pop if it's GPP.
All right, so let's move on to Zach Cooper asks, forget one and done. Who are your picks to win this week? If you just go to facebook.com/thepme, you can find all my picks up on my Facebook page. And there's a hot link and all the articles, too, up on dkplaybook.com. I will say my one and done pick and my favorite pick to win that I'm in on, Tommy Fleetwood. I love my boy Tommy here. Tommy boy coming over. He played last week. I like that he's acclimated to the U.S. already. He's not taking a huge flight overseas. It was cross country, but not, all the way over from, I think he was in the Middle East before that. But I do really like Tommy Fleetwood to win. I think about the players that have had a lot of success here before. Sergio Garcia, Ricky Fowler, Adam Scott, guys that consistently play well. They're elite ball strikers, and Tommy Fleetwood is an elite ball striker. Another name I mentioned is something that we're getting a lot here. Matt asks, we like Adam Scott this week, and I can tell you, I like Adam Scott this week.
Yeah, especially at those odds, right? I mean, if he gets one good round, Adam Scott was he was number one in the world at one point. So it's there. He hasn't played well. He takes a lot of time off, right? So again, trying to figure out why he's taking time off. Is it injury, fatigue, spending more time with family, all these things? But he's played well here consistently in his career. Another guy, right, if you want to talk about one and dones, there's someone that I think is going to do well or win, is a guy, Daniel Berger. I'm keen on these ball striking, right, strokes gained ball striking, and I'm looking more into, if I want to talk about some of the ancillary stats, guys who make Florida necessarily their home. So Berger, who's lost in more playoffs, I think, in the last couple of years than anyone. Poor guy, he was the one guy who was on the short end of that Jordan Spieth, chest bump, which was probably one of the better celebrations in golf. I like Daniel Berger. He doesn't necessarily hit the ball long, right? He doesn't have to here. He stats out nicely in strokes gained ball striking, and when he gets that putter going, I really like Berger's chances here.
So going back to Adam Scott just for a second, when he made his debut at Pebble, he'd been taking time off, just had a kid, just got married. Yeah, he's a very, very rich and handsome fella, so take all the time off you want, but it does seem like he's starting to regain his form. I mean, he's been missing 2-foot putts, he's in mid-season form, but he has putted a lot better on Bermuda and at this course in particular over the years. A former winner at Colonial as well, actually spiked at the Sony Open a few times too. And again, for the people that have been asking, those are the ones that I've been looking at the most, but all par 70s, shorter than 7,200 yards, Colonial, Sony Open, Honda. I've seen a lot of correlation between some of those, although there's far more water on this course than anything. But in terms of Adam Scott, at Pebble, there's only one measured round for him, and he actually gained almost 2 strokes through approach and 1 stroke off the tee that in that one round. Now, he lost strokes putting because he's Adam Scott and he doesn't know how to putt. But last week, in 4 full rounds, although he did try to miss the cut on his own, and then the cut fell back to him, it's all right. He still got through to the weekend, came 53rd. But the big thing, 2 strokes off the tee, over 4 strokes through approaches. Now, he lost 4 strokes putting because, again, he's Adam Scott, can't putt. However, here, I do like him. So I know that he's going to end up being chalky. There's a lot of buzz, and a lot of it is the Bubba factor, that everyone kind of said this exact same thing about Bubba Watson last week, and then everyone, myself included, was far too cowardly to actually pull the trigger on it. People aren't going to make that mistake again with Adam Scott. So I think he's one of those players where you either want to be overweight to him on the field, and right now I have him projected around 20%, or you want none of him to speak of.
Right, and he's another guy that plays really well in the wind, right? Growing up Australia, there's a lot of wind. He does play well. So if you want to factor in the wind this tournament, you can use that to your advantage of picking Adam Scott. And again, he was putting, well, quote unquote, well for him when he had the belly putter, and then when he went back, right, when the rule came down where you can't use the fulcrum in the belly putter, is obviously his putting stats went with that ruling. So yes, right, he pops here. He's a guy that plays well here, right? He's going to be a guy he always plays well in Florida. So yeah, if you're in on Scott, I would totally do that as well.
All right, so Patrick Martino asks, what about Kiradesh Afi Barnrat? I know Feinberg's all over him. Feinberg really loves the barn rat, and it's only because he matches his visor, shoes, and putter all into one. He has played well in Florida before. Strangely enough, At Bay Hill, he's come 6th back-to-back years. The first time he's playing the Honda. Last time we saw him was 2 weeks ago. Overcame a huge deficit to end up winning the Perth Super 6, so that was kind of intriguing. And based on the Fantasy National ownership percentage projections right now, I have him coming in as the lowest owned of this entire range. So when we're thinking about like highest owned, it's going to be Chesson Hadley, and then Adam Scott, and then Louis, and then Rafa Cabrera-Bello. All those guys, and Martin Keimer's in that mix too. I have him at about the 4th the ownership. So I do think that he makes a nice GPP alternative. He isn't someone that I'm going with only because I like the other guys around him just a little bit more. Hadley and Scott, like you mentioned, my pivot play instead of Barn Rat in this range is Keegan Bradley. I'm big on Louis and I'm big on Keimer. So that's the way that I'm going. It's nothing against Kiridesh, but that's just not the way I'm going. I can see him spiking though. Do you have any interest in using him in tournament play?
I mean, I can see, right? I can see the argument. I can see where Kiridesh does pop. I mean, he won that 6-man down in Perth, I believe it was, or in Australia. So yeah, he's coming in current form, right? But again, how much exposure has this guy had on the PGA? Right? Not much. And so in that range for this specific tournament, there's more guys that I'm keen in on. Russell Henley, like there's a lot of value in that range that I'd rather go with than Kiridesh.
The one thing I will say that if you're playing game theory, I do think that he makes a capable tournament GPP flyer. You either have to be sold on him or not, but you don't need to own a lot of him in order to make a mark. Because like I said, he's probably going to project to be the lowest owned, probably 5-ish% in the $4, and even in higher stakes, he's probably, you know what, in higher stakes, he's probably going to be a bit higher owned because people are savvy to how good he actually is. But he's just not a name that people recognize. People can't even say it, so they don't want to use him. They'd rather use Tiger Woods in that area. Now, I would much rather use Barn Rat over Tiger Woods. I'll just use neither of them. This guy asks, can you sell me on Billy Horschel in GPPs? Now, I used a few, so here's the reason why. He's going to be a bit more popular than I think that a lot of people would expect. I would say 6, 7, 8%. Florida guy, he's a Florida Gator. He knows how to putt on these Bermuda surfaces, although it is not his best surface. Bent grass, he actually gains more strokes on. The one big thing that you can take away from it, though, is putting splits. He's a positive putter on bent. He's a positive putter on Bermuda. He is an awful, horrendous putter on POA. He loses almost a half stroke per round on the greens when it comes to POA. Now we're away from POA, so that's always a good thing. Now he's coming off back-to-back missed cuts at the Genesis last week, and a lot of this ties into the change of the putting surface. He lost almost 4 strokes through 2 rounds on the putting surfaces, but gained almost 3 strokes through approach. Billy Ho's a tough one to figure out because the guy pops up for a win like once every 2 years. I'd prefer him in Florida. I'd prefer him on a par 70, and if he's going to be gaining strokes through approaches and not losing them off the tee, that would be the reason that I would go with him. So let's say I play 20 lineups this week, I'll use him in 2. That's enough for me, and I think that's going to be overweight to the field.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the stat symmetry, right, this guy pops, he's just outside the top 25 in the last 24 rounds at greens and regulation. So, right, if it's a par 70, what is the defense? What is the course defense against players? It's going to be the approach, right? It's going to be those long approaches. So, right, the 2 models that he doesn't stat out terribly is in that, in that prox or the approach from the proximity of 175 to 200 and greens and regulation. So there are stats out there that does say a Billy Horschel who wants to do the Gator clamp and on 18 or on 72. I can get behind it. I'm not going to sell you to the I'm not going to sell you till I'm blue in the face. But there are some stats that Horschel does, and he's got nice shoes. So if you want to go with the kick game, then yeah, Horschel is another guy that I could see.
I was thinking about playing him around 25%, and then I scaled back off that. I used him at 10% because I wanted to divvy it up between Hoagie and Ben Martin, who were down in that range too. And I think it's distributing my exposure among some of the riskier, cheaper guys. Let's be real here. None of these guys are locks by any means. So that's the way that I ended up going with it. Thoughts on Keimer? And to mix this into another question, which Euro guy should be a lock? Which Euro guy is a flyer? I actually think that Keimer is kind of a lock here. I like his price, especially in cash games. Over his past 70 tournaments, he's made 89% of the cuts. He's someone that's going to keep the ball in the middle of the fairway. He hits his irons pretty well. If he starts missing the greens, he has absolutely no hope because the guy can't chip. But hopefully he just does what Martin Keimer always does. Hits it to the middle of the fairway, hits a 6-iron into the middle of the green, and hopefully some of the putts drop. But at a hard course where the cut line is probably going to be over par, Martin Kaymer's a guy who's going to shoot like -2 over the course of 4 days, and he's going to be fine. So I really like him in terms of a very safe Euro guy. Now, Fleetwood is safer, Sergio is safer, but they're exceptionally more expensive. I mean, Sergio is probably the safest guy on the board here, but you're paying a premium for that price. Kaymer is someone more at a discount that you can go with. A lot of people are talking about Bernd Wiesberger. Kiradesh has already come up. Dylan Fertelli coming. He's not a Euro. He's a South African, but he's coming over internationally. I like all of those guys, but I won't be going to them. I think that Fertelli's a decent flyer. Bernd, because of the difficult nature of this tournament, could actually be good and win this at like -6, -7. That's the type of style that Bernd wants to play. But I think that Louis is my favorite one of like a GPP flyer pick. I mean, I don't think I'd use him in cash, only because Kaymer is right there, but I do like Louis.
Yeah, I'm with you on that with Kaymer. He's, the last 24 rounds at that par 4, at that distance, he's top 10, right? So Kaymer at that range, it was nice. And Fertelli, he passed the eye test, right? He's going to be a popular play if there is such thing as a popular pivot or chalk pivot, which there is. He's going to be one of those popular guys, right? Not many casual golfers know who Fertelli is. And so at that range, you might see him and say, okay, yeah, at this price, at this range, hopefully no one knows about him. If you're not using Fantasy National, you don't use some of these to see projected ownership. Fertelli is there as well. But a guy like Bernd as well, he gains 2 strokes or something on difficult courses. And so, yeah, he's another flyer you can look at as well. The Euro guys that are making their debut in the U.S., the PGA, I'm not necessarily too keen on, unless it's a guy like Sergio Kaymer, some of these guys who have proven what they've done at this course. But yeah, I mean, Kaymer for me is probably the top, outside of the guys that we mentioned earlier in the show for the Euro. Kaymer is one guy that, stacks out really nicely.
All right, Reid Fowler, thanks for joining us on the Pat Mayo Experience live Q&A. Again, who's your pick to win? Berger, I'm going to go with Tommy Fleetwood. And if I do have like 30 seconds here, I'm going to try to rapid fire all the way through these. Dylan spits hot fire. Ross knows what's going on here. GPPs, would you go Kaymer or Rafa Cabrera-Bello? I would still personally go Kaymer. McGirt or Wes Bryant? I would go McGirt. Can Jim Furyk make a comeback? I wouldn't bank on that. Blaine Berber? Kind of sneaky. Johnny, when I found out that John Peterson had withdrawn, I had been using John Peterson, I switched to John Hunt. He's made 4 straight cuts, tons of strokes gained through approach last week. No short game to speak of, but if he starts hitting some greens, he's going to be fine here, and that'll do it. I'm Pat Mayo. Sub to the show, give it a like, and thank you for watching and submitting your questions. Good luck this week at the Honda. I'll see you next time.
That's correct, right? You're good. You guys are done, right? Mic's off. That was it. Yeah, just turn back on. You're good. You good?